Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, and I'm going to be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. And together, we're going to explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, Joe, I have to tell you, over Thanksgiving this year, I was talking to my nephew, and he mentioned that he had stumbled upon our podcast. Like, he could not remember how he'd found it, and he was listening to it, and it sounded like my voice, and he was like, oh my God, that's my uncle.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Nobody told him about it.
Well, it's very possible that he found out about it by way of Facebook and just kind of forgot about that, but it was still, it was someone who was listening to our podcast and enjoying it, and then suddenly realizing that he knew one of the hosts.
That's a great story.
So who knows?
Wow, I'm smiling ear to ear.
Maybe this is the moment that we go viral, Joe. This could be it.
Maybe it is, yeah. And speaking of virality, you picked a perfect topic for this week.
Right. And this is a podcast where we've delved into some pretty topical and often somewhat depressing topics. And I thought, there should be room in this podcast for episodes on things that I just like to think about. And one of the things that I like to personally ponder, if I have a few moments, are things like, is a virus alive? And I've heard that people have debates about this, about what constitutes life. It's an interesting question as we search for intelligent life in the universe, like what would count as life, intelligent or otherwise. So I thought that I would set you to that question and see if you could find a reason or a rationale for me to decide one way or the other on the question, is a virus alive?
Well, people might think about this subject, Mark, but I'm definitely not one of them. So that's the first thing I want to say. I'm going to be very honest with you. This is one of those metaphysical questions that I would never think about outside the context of mansplaining. But that doesn't mean you asked a bad question. Doesn't mean you're a bad person.
Thank you for the reassurance.
I also think we need to be careful about arguing publicly that viruses are alive, or that anything is alive for that matter. We don't want to give the right-wing wackos any ideas about concocting a right of viral personhood, which would render the COVID-19 vaccines as instruments of murder. Corporations are people, my friend, so why not viruses?
Yes, and to keep things in like fair play, we don't want left-wing to convince itself that there's a huge karmic load to killing viruses, and therefore we should seek viral cooperation and peaceful coexistence either. Like sometimes if it's the bubonic plague, we just need to take that sucker out.
Very good point. Okay, before we grapple with the question of whether viruses are alive, let's first talk about what they are. A virus is a tiny non-cellular infectious agent. Viruses are incredibly abundant. There are more viruses in a single teaspoon of seawater than there are people living in New York City. And there are likely more viruses on Earth than there are stars in the universe.
Wow.
Viruses had plenty of time to become so abundant because they've been around much longer than we have. Some scientists think they're older than any life on Earth, and most agree that they share a common ancestor with modern bacteria and have probably coexisted with life since the first cells evolved. Viruses are basically gene-coding replicators that carry their genetic codes either in single strands of RNA or double strands of DNA. They use that genetic information to invade healthy cells, their hosts, either by destroying the host cell's genetic code or by splicing themselves into it.
Mm-hmm.
Viruses force their hosts to rapidly produce thousands of copies of themselves. After using the host to replicate, viruses often destroy the host as they break away to repeat the process in other cells. That's basically what's going on when you catch a cold.
Yeah, it's a pretty ghastly image, I have to say, of a cell producing so many copies of a virus that it actually bursts, like a balloon popping.
Yes. A virus's raison d'etre is to create more of itself. It's an amazingly malleable agent able to invade all types of life, from animals to plants, from fungi to bacteria. Viruses spread in a myriad of ways, including hitching rides on disease vectors like insects, or via the tiny airborne droplets expelled by coughs or sneezes, or in contaminated water, or even in bodily fluids exchanged during sex. For over 100 years, scientists have changed their minds repeatedly about how to categorize viruses. It's worthwhile to review a little of that history. The word virus comes from the Latin word for poison, and initial interest in viruses came from their association with disease. By the late 19th century, scientists already knew that diseases like rabies were caused by pathogens that behaved like bacteria but were much smaller. Because rabies was transmitted from one animal or person to another with obvious biological effects, scientists initially concluded that the agent spreading the disease was the simplest of all gene-bearing life forms. In 1902, an American physician named Walter Reed, yes, that Walter Reed, discovered that a similar agent had been responsible for an epidemic of yellow fever. Researchers began calling the mystery pathogens viruses, even though they were too small to be seen by microscopes. It wasn't until the development of electron microscopes in the 1930s that viruses could be crystallized and seen by the scientists who predicted their existence decades before. Once researchers could see viruses, they soon realized that they were everywhere, including inside our own bodies. Indeed, viruses have been replicating inside us for so long that about 8% of the human genome is derived from them. That 8% is the remnant of infections in our ancient ancestors. As we unlock the genomes of other living organisms, we're likely to see the same viral influence. In the mid-2000s, French researchers sequenced the genome of the largest known virus, the Mimi virus, which targets amoeba and is about the size of a small bacterium. Their analysis uncovered that the Mimi virus contained more genes than a simple bacterium, including genes for information processing and storage that were previously thought to exist only in cellular organisms. The research team published its findings in the journal Science, writing that the complexity of the Mimi virus's array of genes, quote, challenges the established frontier between viruses and parasitic cellular organisms, end quote. I'll come back to the parasitic nature of viruses when I turn to the question of viral life in a few minutes. Most viruses inside us are latent, meaning they lie dormant and innocuous, sometimes for many years. But they can be reactivated by things like cancers, autoimmune disorders, or even chronic inflammation. A good example is shingles, which is caused by the reactivation of an inactive chickenpox virus that remains in our bodies after we had the disease as children. Did you have chickenpox, Mark?
I did not. I was pox-free.
Okay, well, I did. And while we're on this subject, if you're 50 or older and you had chickenpox, I strongly advise you to get the new shingles vaccine, as I did, so that you don't suffer the debilitating nerve pain of shingles, as my mother did. Viruses can also mutate over time, either from chemical changes in the virus's genetic material or from physical damage or replication errors. Influenza mutates so rapidly that we need a new vaccine for it every year. Coronaviruses mutate via recombination, which is the swapping of bits of RNA with other coronaviruses, and that makes it particularly easy for them to adapt to new species. That recombination is the most likely explanation for how the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 jumped from bats to humans before evolving into the even more infectious Delta variant that swept through the world this past spring and summer, and the Omicron variant that's just hitting our shores as we tape this episode. The world's handling of the COVID pandemic has been a shit show, to say the least, but it's also given us a clear view of how highly adaptable viruses are. What's still not clear is how transmissible they are. A 2018 study found that of the 111 viral families identified worldwide, there are between 631,000 and 827,000 as yet unidentified viruses that, quote, likely have the capacity to infect people, end quote. How many of them will infect us remains to be seen. But after our dreadful handling of COVID, I'm praying it's not many.
Mm-hmm.
In the age of COVID, viruses have a bad name, and deservedly so. Of course, we also reserve the same name to describe malicious code written to alter the way a computer operates, especially if it's designed to spread from one computer to another. When most of us even hear the word virus, we get agitated. But not everything a virus does is bad. For example, the role of viruses in disrupting and restructuring the cells in phytoplankton in our oceans plays a vital role in increasing the efficiency of the ocean's biological pump, which essentially sequesters carbon dioxide from our atmosphere to the ocean floor, thus helping to mitigate climate change.
Wow. Thank you, viruses.
Yeah, that's really something. Here's another example. Oncologists have noticed the regression of cancer in their patients who suffer from unrelated viral infections, which has led to the rise of a new field in cancer treatment called virotherapy that harnesses viruses to target and kill cancer cells.
Yeah.
I don't remember reading about that when we did the cancer episode, so that must be really new.
Yeah.
And I'll bet you didn't know that an ancient virus led to the development of the human placenta, which is the reason why babies aren't born from eggs. Something to think about the next time you order an omelet.
Definitely be on my mind.
It's even possible that the cell nucleus itself, the thing that differentiates animals like us from primitive one-celled organisms like bacteria, originated from a virus that implanted itself in ancient bacteria.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, with all that as background, let's now home in on the controversial question of whether viruses are alive. And I'll tell you up front, Mark, that I'm not going to stake out any new ground here, nor am I going to posit my own custom-made definition of life. I'm already satisfied with John Lennon's definition of life. It's what happens to you while you're busy making other plans.
Mm.
But I will say a little bit about how some scientists have grappled with this question. Biology is the scientific study of life. When biologists were first able to look at viruses, what they saw was a complex package of ingredients that lacked the essential systems necessary for metabolism, which is the biochemical activity of life. For that reason, viruses were assigned the lowly status of inert chemicals, specifically nucleic acids, RNA or DNA, encased in a protein coat. But what complicates the picture favored by most biologists of viruses as inert boxes of chemicals is that they're anything but inert after entering their cellular hosts. Once inside, they shed their protein coats, bear their genes, and induce the host cell's replication machinery to reproduce their DNA or RNA and manufacture more of themselves. The newly created viruses assemble and infect other cells the same way. Does that significant viral activity constitute life? Molecular biologists generally include viruses in a group of cellular building blocks like DNA, proteins, ribosomes, and mitochondria, all of them organic structures that represent either the chemical machinery in a cell or the stuff that machinery uses or produces. I should clarify at this juncture that the people who study viral activity in host cells tend not to puzzle over whether viruses are alive. They're more concerned about what viruses are doing and how they do it, the diseases they cause, and their other manifestations on living things, rather than on policing the disputed border between chemistry and life, which has little practical value to their work. Such myopia is appropriate, I think, because your question isn't really relevant to their research. As you put it in your question, when you first framed it for me at the end of the last episode, whether viruses are alive is more a topic in philosophical or even theological circles than in laboratories. But that's not to say that no scientists have weighed in on the question. As recently as 1962, in his classic textbook, Viruses, Dr. Kenneth Smith posed it as an open question, quote, that must be left to the questioner himself to answer, end quote. The virologist Mark H.V. van Regenmortel of the University of Strasbourg in France and Brian W.J. Mahey of the CDC here in America refer to viruses' dependence on their host cells as, quote, a kind of borrowed life, end quote. Debating whether viruses were closer to chemistry or life, University of Edinburgh microbiologist Nigel Brown weighed in on the chemistry side of the equation, calling viruses, quote, gift-wrapped nucleic acid, end quote.
Mm-hmm.
Now, David Bella of the University of Glasgow disagreed, pointing out that no organism is entirely self-supporting. Human beings, quote, depend on the metabolic activity of nitrogen-fixing bacteria and photosynthetic plants, along with that of our microbiota, end quote. He argued that the virus, quote, made an evolutionary leap away from the cellular form, casting off its weighty metabolic shackles to opt for a more streamlined existence, end quote. Interesting, right?
Yeah, so it opted for efficiency over needless complexity.
Yeah. This guy, David Bella, thinks a better definition of life lies in what he calls, quote, the most critical property of genetic heredity, independent evolution. Life is the manifestation of a coherent collection of genes that are competent to replicate within the niche in which they evolved. Viruses fulfill this definition, end quote. In other words, metabolism is overrated. It's all about genetics.
Yeah, and if I'm hearing that correctly, he's stressing that an evolutionary path is necessary to define life. So, for instance, a prion, which is just a protein which turns other proteins into prions, and in the process causes just terrible diseases like mad cow disease, that would not be life by his definition because it doesn't evolve, it simply reproduces.
I think so, yes. And when we get to the various definitions of life, I'm going to point out the wide swath of those definitions, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. Whether viruses are alive or not has already had important implications for the study of evolution. Most evolutionary biologists understand that viruses play a role in evolution. Nonetheless, because most think of viruses as non-living, their work understates the significance of viruses as if they're not worthy of serious consideration in understanding evolution. For example, the 2002 edition of the Encyclopedia of Evolution devotes only 4 of its 1,205 pages to viruses. By virtually ignoring viruses in the scholarly literature about the tree of life, the many important contributions made by viruses to the origin and development of certain species get misreported as quote-unquote external influences on evolution, like climate change. But viruses are not external. They exchange genetic information inside living organisms. Some virus genomes are capable of fully and permanently colonizing their hosts by adding their genes to that of the host and thereby transforming the genome of the host species, essentially inventing new genes in the process. Mm-hmm. Those new genes might find their way into other organisms. That's a much more direct and immediate effect than climate change, which takes many generations to create evolutionary change. And speaking of direct and immediate, another obvious benefit evolutionary biologists can get from studying viruses is that they evolve right in front of our eyes. 40 years ago, researchers got to witness in real time the emergence of a new virus called HIV-1, the virus that causes AIDS. And of course, there's the novel coronavirus and its variants, all of which emerged in the last 2 years. Viruses might be the only biological entities for which we have a front row seat to evolution in action. Mm. So, to form an opinion about whether viruses are alive, it helps to know more about what makes something alive. A typical dictionary definition of life is, quote, the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. Now, I don't know about you, Mark, but I'm dubious because by that definition, a sullen teenage incel midget would not be alive because he doesn't grow, he'll never reproduce, he's not functional or active, and his condition never changes.
Yeah, that's both a sick burn and a good point. And it also occurs to me that if you could argue that by that definition, a forest fire is alive, because it definitely grows.
Yes.
It consumes, it reproduces itself.
It has functional activity.
And it goes through changes before it dies out.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good point. So I'm rejecting the dictionary definition. Wikipedia identifies these core properties of life as including, quote, growth, change, reproduction, active resistance to external perturbation, and evolution, end quote. Now we're getting somewhere. But that's still a lay definition. So I also checked into scientific definitions of life. There are several other definitions of life that scientists use which come from metabolic, physiological, biochemical, genetic, and other perspectives. But my impression is that no one perspective captures life in its entirety. For example, the metabolic standard holds that living things have definite physical boundaries and continually exchange material with their surroundings without altering their own general properties. Under that definition alone, a candle's flame is alive. It has a well-defined shape with a fixed boundary, and it maintains itself by basically metabolizing its waxes, which are themselves organic compounds, plus the surrounding oxygen to produce CO2 and water, thus exchanging material with its surroundings without altering itself.
Yeah.
My point in saying this is that the same holes can be poked in all the other scientific definitions of life. If you focus on reproduction alone, as the geneticists like David Bella do, then what about the mule, which can't reproduce? I could go on about this subject for another hour. There's fascinating examples about cars. There's a physiological definition of life that cars fit almost all the components of that definition. They eat gasoline, they excrete smoke, they metabolize, they move, they're responsive to external stimuli, and that's basically most of the physiological definition of life. But cars obviously are not alive.
Yeah. And if you add in some hypothetical self-driving car of the future where its software is able to learn and adapt, then that would be a form of evolution, which would even make it even more like a living thing.
Yes. And I saw something fascinating in my reading about how somebody wrote a sentence of, if there were an extraterrestrial looking down on us, seeing all the cars on our planet and how we build roads and communities around cars, that extraterrestrial might think that the car was the dominant form of life on Earth.
Certainly true in Seattle.
Yeah. So because of the inherent deficiencies of all these separate definitions, it's correct to conclude, as the Wikipedia article on life put it beautifully, that, quote, living processes are antithetical to a desire for tidy classification or final definition, end quote. Rather than crafting a comprehensive definition of life, it's tempting, or at least I'm tempted, to employ Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's common sense definition of obscenity, which was basically, I know it when I see it.
Yes, infamous definition.
Yeah, hear me out on this, though. Mules can't reproduce, but I just know they're alive. A flame fulfills many of the metabolic criteria for life, but it's just obvious to me that it's not alive. A single-celled bacterium is alive. It can reproduce, it has an observable birth and death, and it can generate the energy and molecules necessary to sustain itself. A rock isn't alive because it doesn't meet any of those conditions. And just in case you're wondering, Mark, a pet rock isn't alive either.
Take that back.
To our listeners who don't know what a pet rock is, Google it. Okay, here's the dump-de-dump-dump moment. But viruses, it's a tough call, but I come down on the side of non-life. They evolve and reproduce, yes, but not through independent cell division as living things do. Instead, they assemble spontaneously within the living cells of their hosts. They're also not independently capable of the self-regulating, self-governing threshold process called metabolism, which is the internal activity that produces the energy and molecules needed to keep a body going and to sustain life, sometimes referred to as the spark of life. Viruses are essentially parasites that don't respond autonomously to their environment, like living things do. Instead, they rely on their host cells to fulfill the processes I just mentioned, which come under the direction of the virus only after it infects its host. Viruses have been described as, quote, organisms at the edge of life and, quote, non-cellular reproducing agents. A Scientific American article described them as, quote, non-living parasites of living metabolic systems, end quote. The same article acknowledged that, quote, a spectrum may exist between what is certainly alive and what is not, end quote. So maybe it's within that spectrum, that gray area, that you can find the true nature of viruses.
Yeah.
All these descriptions I just read to you sound about right to me, as does this one. A virus is like the parrot in the Monty Python sketch. Not dead, just resting.
Any podcast episode is excellent if it manages to reference the dead parrot sketch from Monty Python. So extra points too.
I agree. So let me give you my hedge before I hear what you have to say about this. Here's my hedge. Even though my answer is no, viruses aren't alive, it does seem like the recent scholarship on this question is trending in the other direction. Around the time you and I were born, the scientific consensus was a firm no, but that certainty has diminished as our tools got better and our knowledge of evolution and cellular and non-cellular processes advanced. So check with me again in a year or 10, and I might have a different view.
Yeah.
I have a final thought, but I want to hear what you think on the yes or no, living or non-living question.
Well, I got two primary thoughts. The first is it's probably correct, but fairly unsatisfying to think that one of the problems in this debate is an overly binary definition of alive and not alive, and that we should allow for sort of a live-ish medium category into which things can be fit that don't seem to sort in an orderly fashion into the categories that we want to provide. And I say that because that's generally true of life, is that we come up with very clear categories and then try to sweep the things that fall outside our categories underneath the rug. That's something that we engage in quite a bit as a species. And so it's probably true in this case as well, is that the answer that's closer to the truth is that viruses are kind of alive. And that's the closest we will come. I will say, though, that the other thing that came up while you were talking this through is that I am very receptive to the notion that viruses are not alive because, like you, they don't seem to feel alive to me. But the argument that they're not alive because it's basically just a chemical process, if you look at creatures that are alive, every single aspect of that life, from their reproduction to their metabolism to their cognition, at some level can be reduced to a chemical process. So I kind of wonder if we're constructing this border between chemical process and life in a way that sort of obscures the fact that life itself is a infinitely complex assemblage of chemical processes.
Yeah, so I agree with much of what you said. Certainly that the binary notion gets in the way here. And it reminds me of our turf episode of not long ago, because one of the issues we discussed in that episode was how, we used to think it was just men or women. Pick one, right? But now we know, as science advances, we know there's intersex. We know there's hermaphroditic. We know there's trans people who are deciding they're non-binary because they feel like they're neither or both. And we need to respect those changes as science bolsters the argument that it's not so simple. Yeah. So I agree with you on that. All right, I have a final thought before we put this to bed. And here it is. Viruses can't replicate in a vacuum. They need a host, as we've said. I think they're like bad ideas that way. Climate change is a hoax. Trump won the 2020 election. January 6th was a false flag operation. Ivermectin cures COVID. Hunting down and killing an unarmed black jogger is an act of self-defense. These are viruses too.
Yeah.
Through the willing hosts of social media and the right-wing fever swamp, they embed themselves in our information ecosystems and replicate, corrupting those ecosystems and infecting them with disease. There's one difference, though. We have tools to protect our bodies from the worst outcomes of physical viruses. We can literally wash our hands of them. And sometimes, when we're really lucky, there are vaccines. I'm afraid it's going to be much harder to rid the body politic of these other viruses anytime soon. And until we figure out a way, they will remain very much alive.
Joe, you cannot introduce something like meme theory, which is one of my favorite things, at the very end of an episode. That is unfair because I've got so much to say on that topic. And it's too much. I will not go into that because that would be another 30 minutes. So just do me a favor and ask me about meme theory on one of these episodes, and then I can get into it as deeply as I want to.
Will do.
But thank you for this. This was very interesting, and I feel like I learned quite a bit. I had no idea that viruses had contributed so much to the development of various species, including humans.
Yeah, nor did I. And there were pages and pages of additional things I could have thrown at you, but in the interest of brevity, I gave you some headlines.
Okay. So, do you have a question for me for next time?
I do. Last year at this time, you asked me a great holiday-themed question about how and why Christmas became such a big deal. I really enjoyed the research for that one, and I thought our resulting conversation was fantastic. As I've told you privately more than once, it's my favorite episode of Mansplaining. And for those of you listeners who haven't heard it yet, check it out. Mansplaining Episode 12, The Thing About Christmas. So I wanted to come up with a question for you this year that suits the holiday season like that one did. I'm sure you've heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot of bleeding going on in the news these days, a seemingly endless stream of unremittingly bad news. We're dealing simultaneously with a worldwide pandemic, climate devastation, the rise of authoritarianism, the complete dysfunction of domestic politics, increasing crime and inflation and paranoia and corruption and cancel culture, as we slide toward a cold civil war that might even get hot. So much bad news, and we've covered a lot of it on Mansplaining. But I want to talk about good news. So for our next episode, Mark, I want you to tell me about some good things happening in the world right now. It can be one thing or a few or several things. It can be happening locally, nationally, or internationally. It can be something well publicized or virtually unknown. That's for you to decide. But come back to me with some good news that will warm my heart and those of our listeners. Are you game?
I'm game. You're asking me for Christmas glad tidings, and I will deliver.
All right. I look forward to it.
Okay, so if you have any thoughts on this episode, or if you'd like to leave comments on previous episodes, we have a Facebook page, which if you've been listening, you know well by now. You can find it at Mansplaining Podcast on Facebook, and we do hope you come by. Give our page a like and leave a few comments. And please, if you got a question and you want one of us to investigate it, pose that question on our Facebook page, and we will make a future episode about it. If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. But that's it for this week. I'm Mark, and that's Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.